I think a good question to start off with, actually, just to make sure people know who Jonathan Edwards actually is,
Hmm.
and kind of what drew you to study him, because obviously your books have talked about him. So who basically is Jonathan Edwards? I think a lot of people basically know, but in case anybody doesn't know, who is he and what drew you to him?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Jonathan Edwards lived 1703 to 1758, just to set the parameters for his life. And if you're looking for a little historical context, you might think of Edwards as being right in the middle of the Salem witch trials, which happened at the end of the 1600s, and the American Revolution on the other hand. So put those right in the middle, and you've got Edwards's life. Edwards lived during the most significant revival in our nation, although it was not yet a nation at that time. But the 1740s are a period that historians and Christian theologians look back on, and we call it the Great Awakening. This was a significant movement of revivalism in the colonies, and Edwards was at the very heart of that movement. In fact, Edwards's primary role in the Great Awakening was to serve somewhat as the theologian to explain what was happening. And there are two major figures involved in the Great Awakening that everybody should know about. The first is George Whitefield, who was actually a British, an English revivalist from the Church of England, who came to the colonies 7 different times on preaching tours. And in the year 1740 and 1741, Whitefield made his way through the colonies, and his preaching, along with the preaching of a number of other significant figures as well, contributed to this massive revival that essentially touched every one of the colonies, impacted practically every church in the colonies at that time, and sparked a number of denominations and certainly a number of professions of conversion, people claiming to have been converted, many of them legitimately so, others perhaps spurious. But Edwards's job then, as a preacher himself, he's a local church pastor and theologian, and his own church experienced revival just 5 years prior to the Great Awakening. So if the Great Awakening is 1740, Edwards's own church, Northampton, has its own revival 5 years earlier, 1735. And Edwards begins to diagnose exactly what happened there. The first thing he would say about revival is that it is clearly a divine work of God's sovereign grace. It's not something that can be concocted by the machinations of men's creativity or new ideas, new innovations, certainly not. Edwards sees revival as something that only the Lord can do. But in the midst of some of these great religious upheavals, there were some other things that Edwards and other pastors thought were less reliable, perhaps even some demonic imitation of what revival might look like. And so part of Edwards's job there is to weigh carefully what is the true work of God in revival and what might be manipulations or imitations or even counterfeits of that real work of the Spirit of God. So nobody denies, I don't think, at least anybody that's conservative, Bible believing, Jesus loving people, we don't deny the legitimacy of the Great Awakening, but any great upheaval like that is going to come with some kind of some baggage along the way. And if Whitefield is the primary preacher, then Edwards was the primary theologian. Now, what drew me to study Edwards myself was his theology of joy or happiness. Edwards has in everything he writes, practically everything, there is a strong thread that works its way through it, and that is the joy of God himself, God's love for himself within the 3 persons of the Trinity, and then the true joy that Christians can have as we experience salvation through Christ by grace. So that's a theme that drew me in, particularly in a period of my pastoral ministry when I was kind of running pretty dry on the happiness tank, if you know what I mean, and stressed out, burned out, just wearied from life and difficulties at family and at work. And Edwards's theology of joy just really, really drew me in. And then I noticed a bunch of similarities. You know, we're both pastors. We both desperately love our churches and want the best for them. We both love our wives and love our children. And we both have a great desire to study God's word in detail. And so I just kind of connected with Edwards in a way that I mean, I love a bunch of other theologians, but just connected with him deeply and really wanted to pour into his writings for a very long time, which is what I've done.